Welcome to Transcendent Psych. In this episode, we are delving into the singularity. Not necessarily the cosmic singularity, but the singularity of being. What is he talking about, I hear you ask? Well, I'm talking about the philosophy of a 13th century mystic, philosopher, theologian. Don't let that put you off if you're not religious, but it won't matter. In this book here, Eckhart's Apophatic Theology by Vladimir Lossky, Knowing the Unknowable God, it's asking the question, is the source of all being itself being? Is it utterly transcendent? Can we know it in any way? Is it anything like the beings and things we see around us? Or are we talking about something that's just really in a category of its own, completely unknowable? Well, what Lossky does for us is he draws out in chapter 1 of this book the influences on Meister Eckhart to start with. So let's start there. One of the major influences on Eckhart was Pseudo-Dionysius, who was a 4th century Neoplatonist. For Pseudo-Dionysius, the one, as the Neoplatonists referred to, ultimate being, or the ultimate cause of being at least, is utterly transcendent. The cause of all being for Pseudo-Dionysius and for people like Plotinus can't itself be being. It must transcend even that category. And it's just unknowable. We just don't have the concepts, the language, the familiarity to be able to even really meaningfully discuss it in a sense. So that's the influence of Pseudo-Dionysius on Eckhart. But Lossky also explains that Eckhart is influenced in turn by St. Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century bishop, who is fascinated by the question of how we can know immutable, unchanging truth that's not just dependent on the mind. And Augustine posits that we need to go and make an inward turn. We turn in on ourselves into the inner man to discover the source of unchangeable, immutable truth. Augustine's not really interested in so much in the encounter with the divine, as he would say it, in that level. I mean, he is, but more interested in touching base, if you like, with this source of immutable truth. But this inspires Eckhart with the inward turn, which we're going to come back to. Another major influence on Eckhart is Thomas Aquinas, a contemporary of his in the 13th century, who was a massive influence on medieval philosophy and theology, Western philosophy in general, up to this day. And we're going to sort of unpack a little bit of his thinking as well. So let's compare these particularly two big thinkers, Pseudo-Dionysius and Aquinas, and then we'll come on to what Eckhart himself has to say about the source of all being. Is it remote? Is it knowable? What's it like for Eckhart? So, as we said, Pseudo-Dionysius thinks of the one, the source of all being, as utterly transcendent. Aquinas says, well, yes, the divine is transcendent, but the divine also is knowable through its effects in the created order. So you might not encounter the being of God directly, but you can see beings like me, the screen in front of you, whatever. We encounter those beings, and by analogy, we kind of encounter a kind of being, things that have their being lent to them by the being that is God. Okay. So Aquinas also is kind of putting God, the divine, the source of all being, as kind of remote, beyond direct real encounter in some sense, and beyond full comprehension, although we can know it to some extent through inferences from what we see in the created order. So what we want to ask then is, what does Eckhart do with this? How do these influences play out in his thinking? Well, he comes out, I think, with quite a radical set of ideas, which I think are intriguing. We'll come back to the singularity as we discuss this in a minute. So let's just be clear on two terms, first of all. So we've already mentioned transcendence, the idea that the source of all being might be utterly transcendent, from the Latin transcendere, meaning to leap beyond, something that is just beyond this current reality, that we knowable reality. And another term that philosophers and theologians might talk about in terms of the divine or being would be immanence, with an A. IMMANENCE. So immanence means basically abiding within the creation. So it exists in the creation. And many theologians might say that the divine is both transcendent and immanent, but different thinkers will put an emphasis on one more than the other. And what Eckhart does, in maybe a stroke of genius, you decide, is he says, he brings the immanent and the transcendent together. And he really kind of talks about, I would say, an immanent transcendence. So he wants to hold on to, on the one hand, Pseudo-Dionysius's transcendence, where we don't reduce the divine or the source of all being, whichever you prefer to call it. We don't reduce it to something that is just easily I'm not going to say this very easily, anthropomorphizable. Oh, I managed it. There you go. The divine is beyond our categories of comprehension. Eckhart is with Pseudo-Dionysius on that. But in a twist, what he wants to say is that the divine is actually still close to us, very close, and we'll talk about that next. Pseudo-Dionysius and the Neoplatonists basically, as we said, put the divine or the source of being as not a thing. I mean, they can't use the word thing. It's not a thing. Well, I'm running out of language. Here you go. All right. As the source that is beyond being itself, that is the cause of being. And Eckhart is kind of like, no, not really. I'm not having that. I'm basically going to say that the source of all being is being, but we're going to retain this transcendence that the Neoplatonists wanted to insist on, and say, well, it's being, or esse in Latin, esse absconditus, being whose nature is hiddenness. And so in one stroke, he keeps hold of the divine as being and the source of being, not something so utterly remote in the sense that, Pseudo-Dionysius and the others would do, but he still insists that this being has a hiddenness of nature that the human mind would not be able really to fully grapple with. But Eckhart also, with Aquinas, will say that you can still make inferences about this source of all being from the being of the universe and the cosmos and reality that we know. The properties and qualities, if you like, reflect that source of being. The difference with Aquinas and Pseudo-Dionysius, the difference between those two particularly and Eckhart, is that Eckhart keeps being as extremely intimate to created things. Because what he says is that everything around us is and kind of boiling over and an overflow from this very ground, or Grund is the word, love that word in German, the Grund, the ground of being itself, that is mysterious. So that applies to you, and it applies to me. And if we add Augustine in here, what Eckhart argues is that we can make this inward turn of knowledge down into the self and into the interior. Lusky uses a phrase I think is quite nice, and describes it rather than an ecstasy, meaning a kind of a transcendent leap out of, ek meaning out, it's more like an ecstasy, So it's as a transcendence of going in and down into the core of our being, which he sees as the divine. So we're not removed or unrooted from the divine in any sense. We're at an outflowing of the divine, an outflowing, and as is creation itself, an outflowing of the divine. Now, where the Neoplatonists would, they would have that view to some extent. They would see, world soul, the cosmos, as a kind of outflowing of the one, but they would do it in a much more, or some of them at least, in a much more remote way, so that it's just utterly transcendent. Whereas what Eckhart's doing, he's saying, no, there is this outflowing, but we are of one being with the ultimate being, and it is the ultimate source is within being as we are. So it's a really interesting idea. Now, what I want to do is to bring in the idea of the singularity into this. So if we think about cosmology, all right, so we think about the Big Bang, we think about black holes. One of the things we talk about, cosmologists talk about, is that the further back in time you go towards the moment of the Big Bang, the more we encounter this kind of event horizon, beyond which the laws of physics break down. We can't really peer behind the veil of the Planck scale and Planck time, where these laws of physics and everything break down. But they would argue that the cosmos is one with, it's a direct outflowing of the being of that singularity moment, even though we can't peer right down into its very original nature. We can see its effects in the cosmos, so you can infer things about it, but you can't know it in itself entirely. And I think that's a metaphor. Please correct me, any Eckhart scholars, if I'm climbing up the wrong tree here, but it strikes me as quite a good metaphor for thinking about Eckhart's philosophy and theology of ultimate being. Here we have, and we can do it directly in our own personal spiritual experience, because we are sentient, conscious beings within being itself, and we can know our being, and we can go down that Augustinian inward turn, not just to find a source of immutable truth, as Augustine wanted to do, but in Eckhart's sense of actually direct encounter. In fact, for Eckhart, it's not really, I suppose, direct encounter. We are always that. We are always that very being. And the further we go down, the more we will reach towards that singularity and towards that event horizon. Now, those of you who maybe are meditators and contemplators, be it in the Christian or Buddhist tradition, will know that as you quieten the mind and you go down and down and down into yourself, first of all, you're just filled with the sort of contents of consciousness in the mind. But as the mind quietens and settles, you almost enter into this sense of no self, as the Buddhists would call it. It's very hard to actually define anything as a kind of me or an I, but there is this quality of I-ness, of consciousness, of awareness. And Eckhart, and I'm going to butcher this phrase, but he has a phrase somewhere, it's not in this chapter that Lusky talks about, but he has a phrase somewhere where he says something like, the eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. I didn't butcher it. But the very awareness that you and I have is the awareness of the divine. It flows out of this being. There's an absolute oneness for Eckhart with the divine. But again, notice Eckhart is often misused almost to claim that, sort of argue that he's claiming that I can say I'm God or you're God. That's not quite what he's saying. Because he's saying the divine nature in its true nature is a nature of hiddenness, esse or deus absconditus. And I would say, I think Eckhart would probably agree that as we go down into the depths of our being, that's also what we discover. We could call it perhaps homo absconditus. But the ground of homo absconditus is actually esse absconditus, deus absconditus for Eckhart. Thanks for listening. I will stop there, and do please let me know, what do you think? How does that, is that something, particularly those of you that have contemplated and meditated, does that resonate with you? What does this do for you? You know, if this is right, and it seems to me somewhat intuitively true, what does that do for you? I like it. It's attractive to me that it's not this anthropomorphizing type of spirituality in any sense, and it's not kind of wooish in that sense of it being kind of like, well, I'm God, you know, you're God, we're all God, and it's more nuanced than that. And it's not arrogant. It's quite humble, and it's saying, the further down we go, we're just going to encounter unknowing. Hence the title of this book, Knowing the Unknowable God by Vladimir Lossky. We might say knowing the unknowable being and knowing the unknowable self, that we are in the divine and in the ultimate source of being as well, perhaps. Pop a comment in, let me know what you think, and give a like, tickle the old algorithm. That would be very gratefully received. And of course, share where you share your podcasts and videos. Thanks for listening. Take care. See you next time. Bye.